Hello transport nerds and fellow planners, and welcome back to Talking Planning. A couple of weeks ago, I managed to take a week off, and in true city kid living in the country fashion, I jumped on a coach and then a plane to enjoy several days in an urban oasis. And that urban oasis was Melbourne, somewhere I hadn't been since 2019. Over the years, I've had my fair share of opinions about Melbourne, and many of them were informed by a period where protests were a regular occurrence. Gang-related crime, or at least its portrayal in mainstream media, and divided communities seemed to be all that was talked about the city. Fortunately, things seem to have settled down a little, so I figured I ought to go and visit again, and catch up with some friends, and of course, go for an explore. Melbourne CBD has some of Australia's best examples of pre-Federation architecture, some of the finest foods, drinks, fashions and goods, which are distributed throughout the city's many streets and laneways. And of course, Melbourne's also known for a rich arts and culture scene. I went out for brunch with a good friend of mine and no one else batted an eyelid when we ordered confit duck at 11 a.m. I also went out and saw a very gossipy musical, all on my own, and no one was staring at me. And truthfully, I had a fantastic time in Melbourne, catching up with people I studied with from Brisbane who also decided that a move interstate was the best opportunity for them. And for many creative career pathways, Sydney and Melbourne tend to be where most of these opportunities are available, and cities like Brisbane, Adelaide, Canberra, Perth and Darwin generally don't even get a look in these industries comparatively. On the other hand, this is juxtaposed when you head out into the suburbs, and I saw a completely different Melbourne to what you see in the city. When I'm saying suburbs, I'm not referring to hip, slightly grungy, inner city suburbs that the 20-somethings love hanging out in like Collingwood or Essendon. I'm referring towards outer suburbs and towns like Melton, which have been significantly growing thanks to lower purchase prices for homes and significant development of housing estates and new growth areas that sort of tack on to these existing centres. Out this way, I got a flavour for some of the social and cultural divides that may have been at the forefront of the media in recent years. These days, it's not often that I go to a place which I feel a little uneasy about, especially working in the planning profession. But some of the behaviours and attitudes I noticed in these areas were a little alarming, and some of the graffiti I saw reminded me of photos of New York subway cars in the 70s. Quite eerie, yet intriguing at the same time. If you want to disprove people that say there's no racism in Australia, well, tell them to go and read the graffiti written on the walls of some of the buses running around the growth suburbs of Melbourne. On this trip, it's clear I witnessed two different Melbournes, and while the contrast can be quite jarring, I am glad I saw both of them on this trip. As an urban planner, this trip was a good wake-up call to understanding the importance of designing inclusive spaces and how land use, transport and social policy can make a huge difference to the quality of life, attitudes towards inclusivity, and how we still have a long way to go, quite frankly. When visiting a big city like Melbourne, it's easy to pick up a postcard with a view from the banks of the Yarra, or a perfectly timed shot of a W-class tram making its way past Flinders Street Station. But it's easy to be seduced by these and not take the time to look at a variety of different aspects that make up a city. I'd like to focus now on something that Melbourne is famous for, that is good, and spans a fairly large area of the urban's extent of the city. Its tram network. Bucking the trend of most Australian cities, Melbourne resisted the urge to rip out its tram network during the 50s and 60s, and the result is not only Australia's largest tram network, but the world's largest as well. So, I want to answer a viewer question as part of this episode from It'll Be Jake. What are your views on trams and their place in planning nowadays? I don't always do viewer questions, but I'm quite happy to answer this one, as it's a lot more nuanced than many that I get asked. A lot of the time, people just want to know what my favourite bus, train, tram or ferry is, and most of the time, honestly, it's not very relevant. What's much more interesting, though, is Does this vehicle or service perform its use case well? And that's basically what this is about. And it's not a simple answer either. In the case of Melbourne, I am very glad they didn't follow the trajectory of most other Australian cities who removed tram networks following World War II. While many cities were dealing with dated tram infrastructure by the late 1940s, Melbourne's tram network was generally quite new, and this helped Melbourne resist the trend of ripping out tram lines that was oh so common post-World War II. One big benefit of keeping trams in place is it helped the city resist the expectation that local shopping districts, high streets, and key urban environments should be focused on moving large volumes of car traffic, something that you'll see in most other Australian cities. Take this snippet of Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, for example, where even on a fairly normal width street alignment, there's space for a bit of on-street parking, cycle lanes, and trams, which have priority, and cars are just expected to stop for alighting passengers. It's normalised in Melbourne's traffic pattern. Most Australian cities would try their hardest to squeeze in 4 lanes of through traffic or on-street parking in 1 lane in either direction outside of peak hours, like you'll see here on a similar size road, Ramsay Road in 5 Dock in Sydney. This, however, brings me on to an important point. Would a system like this work if it was being built today in Australia? Chances are probably not. There are, of course, pros and cons to a traditional on-street tram system versus a separated alignment like most new light rail networks have. But perhaps there is a hybrid of these models which would be the most effective option. One challenge Melbourne faces with a legacy tram system is retrofitting wheelchair accessibility into the network design. Many urban stops are now built with a platform design rather than just being boarded at street level. And since 2001, new trams delivered in Melbourne have all been low-floor accessible vehicles. But this is really only trickling into the system, and there are still large numbers of high-floor trams and street-level boarding across the network. The C2, D1, D2, E1 and E2 class trams have been delivered since to replace the Z1 and Z2 class trams and help add more low-floor tram options into the fleet. But there are still plenty of Z3, A and B class trams roaming Melbourne's streets. Even swapping to a low-floor tram, street-level boarding requires passengers to step up into the trams. Given I travelled quite extensively by tram on this trip, I didn't see any wheelchair or mobility scooters users on board trams. I expect that street-level boarding is quite a significant problem for many users, even on trams fitted with access ramps. Although I take Wikipedia data with a grain of salt, the claimed 73% of Melbourne tram stops not being wheelchair accessible sounds quite realistic. I hope that a cost-effective boarding ramp or platform option can be developed to speed up these improvements to accessibility, as most bus or rail networks have significantly more accessible stops and, of course, accessible vehicles. Unfortunately, it can be difficult to get funding for these incremental style upgrades, especially when the costs to do them may be comparable to building an entirely new tram line. On the surface, accessibility upgrades may seem minor in nature, but when you factor in doing your design works, changing road layouts to accommodate them, and of course the infrastructure at each stop, and then you apply that across hundreds of sites, project costs are likely to be in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. There are also still a significant number of high-floor trams out on the network, and in fact, Camberwell, Essendon and Glen Huntly depots only operate high-floor trams. Whilst it might not be possible to replace all of them in the short term, having depots that exclusively operate high-floor trams and routes that exclusively use high-floor trams mean that there are entire sections of the tram network that are basically off-limits for those who need mobility aids or wheelchair access. On a topic like Melbourne's tram network, I could really get into the weeds. But what is quite interesting is that Melbourne's network has seemed to have maintained its size for a significant period of time. with few major extensions to the tram network in recent history. Apart from a conversion of the St Kilda and Port Melbourne rail lines into tramways in the late 1980s. Numerous extension options have been proposed, but only two have really gained traction in recent years, being a Caulfield to Chadstone, Monash and Rowville extension, and a new tram line through Fisherman's Bend. The first of these is actually being lobbied for as a bus rapid transit option instead, with a rather silly name of trackless trams. It's a bus, just get over it. A bus, let me be clear, can often carry similar numbers of people with the right vehicle design, but please stop calling it a trackless tram. It's a bus. The latter is reliant on an urban renewal project at Fisherman's Bend, so it will be interesting to see what happens with these proposals in time. Still, I think it's best to leave the speculation and detailed investigation on these to the Melburnians, but rest assured, I will be having a closer look at a few types of trams I caught on my recent trip down south, along with, of course, some trains and buses all in good time. And as I hope I've demonstrated today, while I am very glad that Melbourne has kept its tram network, there are lots of challenges to bring it into line with the needs of today. Hopefully, my transport planning colleagues down south can continue to improve on making the world's largest tram network even better. So with that, thank you for joining me, and I will see you again soon.